both this book and the tract of land on which it focuses, Southwest Louisiana's Chenier Plain. And the thing that most gives me such comfort is the depth and breadth of the author's treatment of that relatively small landform, as indeed unique in the purest sense of the word. The author has deftly interwoven myriad threads of vastly different origins and natures to produce this one-of-a-kind magnum opus. So, without any further ado, please help me to welcome Mr. Richard D. Crowell.
Thank you all very much for having me here tonight. This is a very special event for me. There's so many people here. I feel like amongst a part of my family that I knew many, many decades ago. We have how many descendants of Lividay Connor here in this room?
Well, it's Adler. Yeah.
Well, Adler Connor. But anyway, Adler Connor, his son Lividay was the manager of the Coastal Club for 33 years from 1954 to 1987. And he was a legend in his lifetime. He was a brilliant man and a very kind and gentle soul. And I have wonderful, fond memories of it. One of the memories is not so great. That the overall overseer of the Coastal Club at that time was a fellow by the name of Mr. Lottinger. And Mr. Lottinger was imposing, and he hated children. And I was a child when I met him, so everybody tiptoed around him. But Lividay would rise to the occasion and take care of us and make sure we had a great time in this unique place. This project of the Chenier Plain did not begin with the concept of a book of Chenier Plain duck hunting or the political or economic history of the region. Originally, the impetus was curiosity about the Coastal Club's main lodge and its first boat, the June B. Who designed the lodge? When was it built? Where did the June B come from? And what happened to her? The search for these few historical facts began in 2009, but there were no direct answers to pull from a filing cabinet or storage box. From my perspective, the thrill of the hunt for the untold story of this region became the driving force. Determining the events surrounding the building and boat expanded into new territory of economic development, the history of commercial market hunting in Louisiana, and the transition to the region's legacy of sport hunting, and individual hunting clubs' research activities on wildlife habitat conservation. Also, the background on the land was not a simple chain of title, but a series of historic events controlled by less than a half dozen extraordinary men. Their actions and the economic and cultural changes they shaped during their brief appearance in Southwest Louisiana led to placing their story in the context of hunting in a one-of-a-kind place. Academic papers, scientific journals, courthouse filings, and private and university archives were primary sources for my research on Watkins, Chalkley, Knapp, Clarence Burden, and wildlife harvest data. In 1981, in an interview of Barbara Tupman, she said, "History written for the general public rather than scholarly readership, usually with a strong emphasis on narrative and portraiture, is often viewed disparagingly by academic critics who feel their territory has been encroached upon. My attempt is to communicate the little-known story of hallowed ground to Louisiana history buffs and sportsmen. By placing this 200-year history in one volume, there is no question the foresight, aspirations, and impact of a handful of protagonists left an imprint that is palpable today." Let me begin by saying you have a rich history, and I urge you to be proud of it. In 1524 is when it all began, not here, but somewhere else. An Italian explorer under the King of France, was the first European to make landfall in Nova Scotia. He was so enamored with the region, he expropriated an old Greek mythology word, Arcadia, A-R-C-A-D-I-A, to define the Bay of Fundy as a place of pastoral rural peace. In other words, it was his term for paradise. The nickname stuck, but it was misspelled when the R was dropped by the early French settlers and became famous when Acadians were removed by force from the region in 1755. When these Acadians landed in southwest Louisiana, a population of only 3,000 rural French people ended up in a place that could have no ancient history. It hasn't been here that long to have an ancient history. Whether good or bad, water was and continues to be the problem. It is not only the great attractor of wildlife, the region is bucolic wetlands with little terra firma for human habitation. And what is not constantly wet is mostly a moist soil environment, which is fragile and vulnerable. This damp region was only formed in the last 3,000 years. Geologists commonly express stratigraphic timelines in millions of years, but the Chenier Plain was formed in an eye blink of geologic time, which makes it possible to compare its formative period to similar events in recorded history. In the 5th century BCE, the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens and Grand Chenier were under construction at the same time. The Anasazi Indians in the American West and the Great Pyramids of Giza predate the existence of this entire region. Once created, however, this stretch of Louisiana coastal region is home to the largest concentration of migratory wildlife in North America, and it hosts the largest percentage of birds on the American ornithologist list. Even though it is in the neck of this massive living funnel, the irony, it is the least populated region in the state. Very little of it is above sea level, and what is not was tidal before we got involved. In the words of Aldo Leopold, who was a great nature writer, with abundant wildlife arriving and passing through in all seasons of the year, this sparsely populated region, time lies thick and heavy on this place. Scratching the surface of this lonely region exposes its painful and dramatic history of national expansion, statehood, forced resettlement, and development by 5 visionaries that is not commonly known. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past? Asked young Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836. He said, the sun rises and shines today also, and there are new lands, new men, and new thoughts. The same question was posed to David McCullough, who is an author and historian that we're all familiar with, and he responded, studying history shows us how to behave. It is interesting because things did not have to turn out the way they did. They might have gone the other way. In other words, the future is not inevitable. As we dig, we are given an understanding of why an illiterate Cajun, a young Midwestern lawyer, a university president, an aristocratic Englishman, and a furniture salesman act the way they did. These men did not record their private thoughts in journals, and there is no cache of letters revealing insight. But we can assess their state of mind by examining their achievements and dramatic failures. While on the Chenier Plain, they concentrated on accumulation of wealth and giving us the first flagship hunting clubs in southwest Louisiana that ushered in the region's legacy of sport hunting. Cumulatively, their decisions are the 19th and 20th century history of this desolate expanse of wetlands that is barely above sea level. These individuals left footprints that resonate today. Stephen Ambrose writes that part of North America lying between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountain was up for grabs at the end of the 18th century. The contestants were the British coming out of Canada, the Spanish coming up from Texas and California, the French coming up the Mississippi River from New Orleans, and the Russians coming down from the Pacific Northwest, and finally the Americans flooding westward. At the same time, President Jefferson felt France had the most powerful military in the world, and he nervously watched Napoleon form a position of superior strength on the European continent. In 1800, he watched Napoleon coerce Spain into retroceding the Louisiana territory to France. Jefferson viewed this as a threat to his ambition of expansion beyond the original colonies huddled along the Atlantic seaboard. Charles Sereny writes, he feared Napoleonic France the most, and his chief preoccupation was to search for a way to bar this unwanted neighbor. Jefferson waged a diplomatic and public campaign against France not to even think about establishing an empire on this side of the ocean. Fortunately, Napoleon had a mixed bag of sea change events on his plate. He was in need of money to finance his European ambitions. He had little interest in the Louisiana Territory, but he did not want it to fall in the hands of his nemesis, Great Britain. And he was determined to dominate Europe. It must be remembered that at this point in time, in the early 1800s, Napoleon's power train still had 15 years to go before his fateful Sunday at Waterloo. To replenish his drained treasury, he called in his ministries and said, I renounce Louisiana. It is not only New Orleans that I see, it is the whole colony without reserve. The rest of the story is familiar. In 1803, with the stroke of a pen and $15 million, Jefferson doubled the size of our country in the largest land transaction ever without firing a shot. Jefferson did not have easy sailing getting the money from Congress. The Federalists were content with the size of the country, and they saw little need for additional territory west of the Mississippi. Also, he faced a cultural brick wall in New Orleans. The multicultural society enjoyed their French traditions, Catholic faith, French language, and they wanted it to remain that way. That they were comfortable in their foreignness resulted in Jefferson being very suspicious of their loyalty to the new nation. According to Lawrence Powell, the author of The Accidental City, New Orleans was considered a foreign country by many Americans from the colonial states, and as a result, New Orleans became even more French after the purchase than it had been before. But Jefferson adjusted to political reality, and as we all know, New Orleans is not going to change. Explaining his foresight, he chose the metaphor of a responsible guardian purchasing important property with his minor ward's money, then telling him when the minor becomes of age, quote, I did this for your good. I thought it was my duty to risk myself for you, close quote. And with that one phrase, he got his money. But this mighty event failed to bring Southwest Louisiana under the American flag. It still was under the Spanish flag. The state lacked its familiar hunting boot shape. It did not have a heel. But that did not slow down the progress of bringing Louisiana in the Union in 1812. Southwest Louisiana remained under the Spanish flag in 1800. When it was retroceded to France, it remained under the Spanish flag in 1803 at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, and it remained under the Spanish flag in 1812 when the United States Congress and the President signed and authorized Louisiana to become a state. They plowed forth in state claim. The 5 parishes comprising the questionable region in South Louisiana at that time was called the neutral zone. The region's complex political history was not settled until 1819 by John Quincy Adams who at that time was Secretary of State under President James Monroe. And he negotiated with His Catholic Majesty, King Carlos IV of Spain, and agreed to recognize the Sabine River as the west boundary of the state. During the North American campaign of the French and Indian War, the British suspected the French colonials in Nova Scotia, the maritime provinces, could not be trusted unless they abandoned their religion, swore allegiance to the British crown, and agreed to take up arms against their French ancestral homeland. Their refusal precipitated the Great Expulsion in 1755. In 1847, the event was placed on the world stage by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his poem Evangeline. This epic drama did not occur in Louisiana, although it is their history. And I'd like to read 4 lines from the poem. They were before as strangers, meeting in exile, became straightway as friends to each other, drawn by the gentle bond of a common country together. They who dwell there have named it the Eden of Louisiana. The same 3 factors that perturbed Jefferson in his relations with the territory of Orleans now seems to support a basis of welcome for these Acadians without a nation. It can be argued Jefferson inherently believed the Anglophile, the English culture, religion, common law legal system would coalesce the new nation in one homogeneous unit. Language, French, religion, Catholic, legal system, code, Napoleon, were not what Jefferson had in mind. These factors were like waving a red flag. But the Acadians were in their element, and most of all, they were comfortable. They were speaking French in a Catholic church, and French being spoken in their courtrooms, and for those few who could read, all the laws in the state at that time were published and written in 2 languages. But following Reconstruction era, dramatic change would be forced on the land by 3 opportunistic entrepreneurs, though none were Acadians. Conditions were tempting, land was cheap and abundant. At the beginning of the last 2 decades of the 19th century, and that's the last 2 decades of Queen Victoria's reign, ownership of Southwest Louisiana was predominantly in state and federal governments. Except for a few Acadian vasheries, private ownership was virtually non-existent. This void in private ownership created an opportunity for a visionary with capital. The arrival of Jabez Bunting Watkins and his financial backer, Henry George Chalkley from London, filled this vacuum in the early 1880s. Watkins and Chalkley owned an English syndicate located and domiciled in London, descended on the Chenier Plain like an unexpected Category 5 hurricane. By 1900, they virtually seized southwest Louisiana, below the 30th parallel, which is approximately Highway 14 today. Watkins was born in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and that's where Punxsutawney Field lives. It tells us when winter's going to stop and spring's going to start. And he was raised in a 2-room log cabin in Manassas, Virginia. And as a child, he and his mother and siblings would sit on the front porch and they watched the Battle of Bull Run, which was the major first battle in the Civil War. Following law school, he established a mortgage lending business in Kansas for rural farmers. In 1878, in his mid-20s, he went to London for a prearranged introduction to Henry George Chalkley, and together they formed a joint venture for Louisiana land investment. Over the course of the next 10 years, they bought, and the number vacillates depending on what documents you look at, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million acres of southwest Louisiana at a cost of 12.5 cents to $1.25 an acre. With this massive ownership and not being a farmer, Watkins needed an agricultural expert, not only to develop various uses for the property, but market this farmland beyond the edges of the marsh. His brother was a physics professor at Iowa State Agricultural College, which today is the University of Iowa. And his brother suggested that they recruit the college president, Seaman A. Knapp. Knapp was intrigued by his host's scheme to convert southwest Louisiana prairies and marginal wetlands into large-scale rice production. And if successful, it could propel Louisiana into becoming the dominant rice region in the country. But at heart, he remained an educator, even though he recruited over 30,000 farmers to take advantage of cheap farmland. This event set the stage for the unspoken basis for Knapp's legacy, which is illiteracy. And the reason I say that is that he came down and he wanted to improve the lot of the local farmer. He brought his library with him from Iowa State Agricultural, but they couldn't read. So he went out and did demonstration farms. His demonstration work took root, and in his words, quote, "Best of all, Acadians soon learned to do as well as the newcomers by learning from demonstration." Knapp laid out the towns of Iowa and Benton after attracting farmers from his old college region from Ames, Iowa. He started the farmer-friendly Calcasieu Bank of Lake Charles. He founded the Lake Charles Rice Milling Company, the first rice mill west of the Mississippi River. After 22 years in Louisiana, he moved to Washington, D.C. and formed the Farm Demonstration Work, which colloquially we call it the Ag Extension Service. He also formed the 4-H Club of America.
What year did you say he showed up here?
Huh?
What year did he show up here?
About 1898 to 1900. LSU in 1953 dedicated the Seaman A. Knapp Hall to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the first agricultural demonstration conducted for farmers under Knapp's tutelage. By the mid-1920s, the syndicate, the English syndicate of Knapp, Chalkley, and Watkins amassed enormous wealth. Watkins returned to his Midwest office in Kansas, and having no children, he married his secretary of 30 years. He practically built the University of Kansas and one of the largest teaching hospitals in the Midwest that continues to this day. When Watkins left Louisiana, W.T. Block was a reporter and a historian for the Beaumont Enterprise, and he placed Watkins' wealth in 1925 at $25 million.
Yeah.
I consulted an economics professor at Tulane and at LSU, and together we worked up a formula to take $1925 to see what the present value is, and we did it at $2014. That would be worth $26 billion today. Watkins was the richest man west of the Mississippi River. Watkins' business partner, Henry George Chalkley Jr., arrived on U.S. soil at the age of 22 and continued to run the North American Land and Timber Company, which today is North American Land Company and is also Sweet Lake Oil and Gas Company. He, like Watkins, was not reticent. He ended his career chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. But Watkins was the poster child for the merit-based success story in the South. He clearly came from further behind than any of his business partners. He entered the world penniless and left and like many of our nation's founding fathers, he was possessed with enormous resources completely within himself. On the flip side of the economic coin, Julian Duhon, an Acadian, owned 1,680 acres, and the tract was like a bateau in the middle of the Chalkley Ocean. From any vantage point, the horizon was not only marsh flat, but it was all owned by Chalkley. Not yet a teenager, we know Duhon was captured twice. This is when he was 11 and 12 years old. He was released after fighting in the Battle of Vicksburg. He was one of the outlying pickets. From family interviews and glimpses of what he accomplished during his life, It is fair to say he was illiterate and clearly hardened by the Civil War and years of privation on the Chenier Plain. But he defied a forecast of poverty. His vashery was described in the deeds as being, quote, salt marsh and prairie subject to tidal overflow, and he bought it for $1.50 per acre, and he signed all of his deeds with an X. Not having a bank account, we do know that he occasionally needed money, and he borrowed $3,000 from Chalkley and signed a mortgage on his 1,600 acres with an X. 2 years later, the public records tell us Duhan sold his tract before he paid his loan off to Chalkley. Trying to get my head around his motive to sell, and more important, selling to whom, I kept circling back to Duhan's background. Like all Acadians his age, he was scarred by the short and direct ancestral link to why he even lived in this part of the world. Probably not knowing another Acadian with resources to buy his vashery, my assessment is that he would not sell to a Chalkley. And why not? If Chalkley had money to lend him, he certainly had money to buy 1,600 acres in the marsh, and in so doing, plugging a hole in his vast holdings. We must remember, Chalkley was born and educated in England. Arriving in Louisiana as a young man, he would sound like a cultured Englishman, whose ancestral homeland initiated Le Grand Derangement. Conversely, Duhan was only separated by 3 generations from his family's forced migration from Nova Scotia. Arguably, with this background in his bones, it is doubtful Duhan would sell to an Englishman, even if he were an American. But over Christmas of 1912, language had its bonding effect. In December 1912, James Dever, a Texan from Waco, Texas, was living in Lake Charles. He bought 840 acres on the north boundary of Duhan's 1,600 acres. And coincidentally, he was fluent in most dialects of Cajun French. Perhaps Duhan found comfort in his native language. Within 22 days of Dever arriving on the scene and speaking to Duhan in his dialect of Cajun French, he bought Duhan's 1,600 acres, and this single act ended Acadian ownership of what will become the Coastal Club property. 100 years earlier, in 1820, John James Audubon, at the age of 35, shoved off from the banks of the Ohio River in Cincinnati and drifted down to New Orleans. After 87 days on the Ohio and Mississippi River, he landed, and the first thing he wanted to do was to write a letter back to his family. But everything was closed because New Orleans was celebrating a French fete for the Battle of Orleans. So instead he went to the French market, which was right next door to where his keel boat was tied up. There, in his journal, he writes, found vast many mallards, some teals, some American Wegians, Canada geese, snow geese, mergansers, robins, bluebirds, European starlings, and telltale godwits, everything selling extremely high. Almost 100 years after Audubon visited the French market, vast many waterfowl were still being sold. Gay Gomez, in her book, A Wetland Biography, writes the French market in 1910 was selling an estimated 3 million ducks per year. But if you go back and look at the population of New Orleans of about 330,000 people in 1910, that's only 10 ducks per person over the course of a year. So it's not, population-wise, it's not that much. Acadians hunted ducks from the arrival of the fall migration through the spring breeding season. William Thibodeau, the engineer for tonight's meeting, he's a historian journalist, said during this era, quote, duck hunting was not considered a sport. Ducks were harvested like a crop, close quote. Due to this hunting pressure, at the end of the 19th century, sportsmen were demanding protective action. According to Charles Riger, Most wildlife conservation legislation originated with sportsmen. By 1913, sportsmen pushed for the Migratory Bird Act, which gave custody or basically ownership of all migratory wildlife to the United States government. The conservation effort culminated in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which outlawed all market hunting of migratory birds. E.A. McElhaney said during this transition period, the greatest number of ducks in Louisiana has been reported from the coastal Chenier Plain region, and the majority of shipments of market ducks to New Orleans originated in southwest Louisiana. In less than 2 years after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, the Chenier Plain became an island confronting an assault from all points on the compass. Outsiders rushed in and fundamentally usurped control over the wetlands so that a moat seems to have moved across the ridges. Following in the footsteps of Watkins, Knapp, and Chalkley, the late 19th century sportsmen created a breach in the isolated existence of the Cajuns. But that said, these outsiders left the French culture untouched and dominant and remained itinerant wetland owners who annually anticipate the largest concentration of migratory waterfowl in North America, not to mention the evolving Cajun cuisine. And why do I use the word evolving Cajun cuisine? My research contradicts the commonly held impression on the origin of Acadian food. Acadian immigrants were from the peasant class in France. They remained peasants in the New World, whether Nova Scotia or southwest Louisiana. It must be remembered these immigrants were driven to the subtropics from Nova Scotia, which was a region that is 15 degrees latitude south of the Arctic Circle, and they faced an entirely different growing season down here. Patricia Harris writes, Cajun food for the most part represents a blending of the tastes of 4 distinct groups: American Indian, French Acadian settlers, Spanish colonials, and African slaves. To say the food is experienced today on the Chenier Plain is the same as the Acadian settlers is a myth and tourist gimmick. This amalgam of cultures began with the exposure of the Acadians to the Creole and African slave population in New Orleans. We all know the foundation of Acadian food is a root, and perhaps that is the only ingredient transported from France to Nova Scotia and then to South Louisiana. And the story is told in the history of the word gumbo. Gumbo derives its name from the okra pod, which was brought to New Orleans on the first shipment of slaves in 1719. From the Bantu language, which is a sub-Saharan African language. Their word okra was translated into French when the first slave ships dropped anchor in the mid-Atlantic French colonies. The new French word invented at that time was spelled G-O-M-B-A-U-T. It must be remembered, prior to the arrival of these slave ships, okra was unknown in France and the New World. In Anglophone English world, G-O-M-B-A-U-T was corrupted and it became our gumbo that we love today. Dan Jarowski writes, the language of food helps us understand the interconnectedness of civilizations. Following the demise of market hunting, and once these hunting clubs were established, they needed more than good food to survive. A few started keeping data on waterfowl migration and habitat conditions. They were interested in what marsh conditions attracted ducks and what didn't. To ensure survival for the long term, perpetuation of successful hunting was imperative. Of the 4 surviving clubs organized prior to 1929, the Coastal Club not only records daily harvest information, but with reliance on professional biologists, they intensely analyze this data and season to season evaluate the attractiveness of their marsh. It is important, they've come to the conclusion, it is important to maintain a bird's eye view of the wetlands as enticing and natural as possible. Also, examining historical data has confirmed that the waterfowl migration of the Mississippi flyway is changing. In the early years, certain species were everywhere. However, today they cease to appear in bag limits, but new species have taken their place. While Louisiana hunting clubs have no direct control over the size of the Chenier Plain migration, they have found that continuing moist soil education and creating new habitat coupled with active marsh management will give some reliance that there will be another good hunting season. Hunting began out of necessity. It was the means of survival. Then market hunting thrived along coastal Louisiana for 100 years as a profitable business, ending with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. This conservation measure created a sport that has become the metaphor for the region's legacy. There is little doubt, understanding this rich history of the land and the people who delivered these venues to us can do nothing but add weight to the inheritance of the next generation. Thank you all very much.
I have a
We want to
question.
ask some questions. Now would be a great time. If anybody has questions, go ahead.
Along the coast, there are at least 2 refuges. Well, one is Russell Sage Wildlife Refuge, and then there's Rockefeller. Can you talk about how those came about?
Well, the Russell Sage and the Paul Rainey refuge came about almost at the same time. And Russell Sage was a railroad magnate living in New York, and he was a friend of E.A. McElhaney. And he got Mr. Sage to put up the money to buy that property and donate it to the state to become a wildlife refuge. And he also knew Paul Rainey, who was from the Mississippi Delta country, who was a very wealthy guy. And he got him to put up the money to buy the 28,000 acres that's the Rainey Wildlife Refuge. And also the Rockefeller Refuge, 85,000 acres. At about the same time, McElhaney bought that, but he didn't want to have to finish paying for it. And he happened to know John D. Rockefeller in New York. So he went to New York, met Mr. Rockefeller, and got him to reimburse him the money that he had put out to buy that 85,000 acres. And Rockefeller bought it and donated it to the state of Louisiana.
All right, thank you.
And that all happened in the 20s.
Okay.
When did the Lacassine Wildlife Refuge come into that play?
The Lacassine Wildlife and the Grand Prairie, about the same time. Those were the 2 of the first wildlife refuges that were purchased by money raised strictly from the sale of federal duck stamps. The first federal duck stamp was 1934-35.
Yeah, because I know Lacassine Wildlife Refuge goes right up against the Coastal Hunting Club.
That's right. It's right across the Bell City Ditch, Bell City Canal.
Yeah.
And then on Lacassine is on the east side of the Coastal
Right.
Club, and on the west side of the Coastal Club is Grand Prairie.
Well, Grand Prairie property was acquired from one of our uncles, which
Okay.
is Levity's sister, Mr. Claude Eagleson. Uncle Claude was the
Okay.
sheriff of Cameron Parish for
Okay.
50 years, I think, and they acquired that property for that from him. I know the state had bought it. That hadn't been that many years ago.
No, it's not. It's the newest of. It's the
Right.
newest, but it was all purchased with federal duck stamp money.
Okay.
That's where the funds came from to buy the property.
Yeah, my ears kind of peaked up when you started talking about gumbo. So I got to hear, you said that your research contradicts other research. So can you just juxtapose those 2?
Well, it's commonly held that the Cajun cuisine was brought here by the Acadians in 1755 when they were thrown out of Nova Scotia, and that's not correct. That what we have today of the etouffees and the gumbos and the jambalayas and things like that that we all love, that evolved just over the last 100 years.
I see, okay.
I have a Louisiana history question. I'm not a native of Louisiana, so this is a stupid question, I apologize up front. But why did the Spanish give up New Orleans so easily? Did the French die of fire and shot or going into war?
In the late 18th century, Spain could hardly fight its way out of a wet paper bag. They had just mismanaged their empire, and it was all crumbling and falling apart. Their military wasn't very strong. And then they had right across the border, they had Napoleon,
Yeah.
who was pretty strong.
How,
He
just gave up,
He just basically bulldozed over Spain.
How vile is the Napoleonic Law still in the Louisiana areas? Is that still practiced?
Well, this gentleman sitting right to your
It
left.
is. Our Louisiana Civil Code,
It's still Napoleonic?
well, it comes from Spain, actually. It went from Spain to France, and it was the 7-part code in France, Lafayette Partidas. And then Napoleon liked the organization of it, so he had it translated into French. And it's still the same. It's almost verbatim, most of the code articles.
I think our code was adopted in 1825, something like that.
That sounds familiar, but I wouldn't have said it if
I think something sticks in my mind like 1825. And it's very unique in the United States. Yes, sir.
This gentleman's question about Spain and its turning over of New Orleans, and then you said Spain was in tatters, but to me, the most powerful naval fleet was the Spanish Armada.
But that was before all this. I mean, the Spanish Armada was before all of these events took place. Spain was in significant decline around 1800, I'm sorry.
When you talked about Cajun cuisine and its origin, when I grew up, I was told different little folklore, and a word, cochon, is a pig. And when the slaves got pork, it was the leftovers, things we now call pig ears and pig feet and crackling and boudin, the intestines, tripe and white liver and all these things. And now they're coined as Cajun cuisine, but true origin is it was just the leftovers that
Yeah.
they got.
It is.
Do we have any more questions for Mr. Crowell?
Thank you all very
All right.
much for
Yeah,
having
let's
me.
give it up for him.
Enjoyed it.
Just some housekeeping. If you would like to get a copy of the book, that's fantastic. You just come up this way, grab a copy. He'll sign it for you. I'll be handing out sticky notes if you want him to address it to somebody, or even your own name, just to get the spelling straight. I want to thank you all for coming. Events like this are important. We always want the bookstore to be a community destination where we celebrate local authors and local art. So you coming is what makes that possible. So thank you all so much for coming. Let's give it up one more time for Mr. Crowell before he goes. That's it, guys. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And I wanted to introduce myself also. This is my first time I got invited by Neil to attend. My name is Keith Nickerson. I'm a local writer. And I have a little info for y'all. These are my books I have on. Okay. Thank you.